Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 11 of TL Blue. My name is Richard Granger, and I'm the global DFIR lead at Triskel Labs. We've got a very special guest today, co-hosting. It's Jack Rutherford, who is our Chief Technology Officer. How you going, Jack?
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, I'm going really well. Happy to be here and keen for the episode.
Yeah, we've got a couple of interesting topics to discuss today. Do you want to quickly run through a little bit of a sneak peek of what to expect?
Yeah, absolutely. So, hot off the press today, we've got the Australian Cybersecurity Centre annual report that we're going to go through. Certainly a topical one in the broader Australian threat landscape, one that causes a lot of boardroom discussions, a lot of presentations from security vendors to executives to try to sell more cyber, but also very important insight coming out of that one.
Yeah, and that dropped during
news articles.
CyberCon, didn't it? Straight in the week to
Did.
CyberCon. Yes.
Good timing, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I wonder if that was intentional.
Yeah.
Got a few news articles that we think are quite relevant too today. So there's a big one coming out of the US at the moment, under which it looks like a teenager from Texas has been arrested as a result of what they're calling some of the largest hacks ever on various telecoms across the states. It seems like he was associated with the Scattered Spider threat group too. So lots to dive into with that one.
Yep.
And quite an important one too is an article that's come out from IT News that looks at how many prosecutions there's been, convictions for cybersecurity in Australia in the last 6 years. So plenty to dive into there. And we'll finish off with the vulnerability of the fortnight as well. We're going to focus on Mitel MiCollab, that one.
Excellent.
So, to start us off, the ACSC report.
Yes.
What are your thoughts? Tell me.
It's good. I like it. I enjoy reading all this collated information and some of the insights as well that were put through into this report. As you mentioned before, I think it's very beneficial for not only higher up in organizations, so your board and your C-levels, to get an understanding of what sort of the threat landscape is in Australia, but also for like practitioners as well. It's very useful information that they're putting through in this report.
Yeah, from our point of view, I think the really key parts that we look at is it's interesting to see how it aligns with what we're seeing in our kind of limited visibility view of the Australian landscape. And it's also just interesting to see, you know, what are the major threats? Does that align with what we think they are? The differences between threats affecting your average Australian small business versus larger critical infrastructure entities, and the various threat actors out there and what they're doing, how they're changing over time as well.
Yeah.
So look, I've got a few points here, and I'll ask you about a few of them as well. The things that I pulled out from this that I think are quite interesting this year. Quite early on, they talk about a term that I've not heard used before, so I'm interested to hear if you've heard much of it. Grey zone activities. Are you familiar with this term?
No. Grey zone activities. Interesting.
So it looks like it's used to refer to things that aren't quite all out acts of war against the country, right? But also things that are angling one's intentions that might be detrimental to another country. Things that are kind of in the middle. A great example, I think, and one that's quite topical for this report is disinformation. Disinformation is not something that we as a business deal with on a day-to-day business as much, day-to-day basis, but it's certainly something that affects broader society. And the other concept they raise as well is pre-positioning. So this is where I can only assume you're putting technical things in place, you're putting attacks in place, you're setting up infrastructure, you're dropping web shells to be used later that might allow you to take quite significant actions if it did become quite serious later on.
Yeah. So if there is a conflict, essentially you've got the back doors, you've got the positioning to cause serious impact if it came to that.
Yeah. Indeed, indeed. So they speak a bit about that. And then, I mean, there's a bit of a natural progression into, um, the major threat actors that are affecting Australia. I mean, if I was to give you two guesses at the big two, right? What do you reckon?
Yeah. Yep, I can guess those two countries.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that is typically Russia and China. But what I found particularly interesting as an insight was we know that for the most part, when we talk about ransomware, it's typically coming out of Russia, right?
Yeah.
China, though, attacks typically quite more difficult to detect.
Mm.
Often they prefer to stay hidden. Maybe this is, part of the pre-positioning thing that we spoke about. But it looks like they're becoming more and more active, is what the report says. So their patterns of behavior and the targets that they're actually affecting are changing, which I think is quite significant.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what we see as well. Like I know you and Nick have responded to sort of nation state attacks previously involving or believed to involve China, where it's a lot more stealthy, a lot more um, sort of targeted in information collection rather than what we see with the ransomware groups is at the last stage is the go loud stage, right? That's when they encrypt systems and they want you to know that they've been in your environment, they've stolen your data, they've encrypted systems to try and make some money out of it. Where nation state attacks are typically going to be a lot more stealthy. They're not trying to be identified. They're trying to blend into traffic and potentially as well going on for much longer periods of time. In ransomware, sort of recently, we've seen a fair few sort of hit and run, I guess you could call it, where the time they've been in the environment might be, a day at max. But we do still see, the occasionally where they've been in the environment for a longer period of time, like a couple of weeks. But yeah, definitely seeing a bit more faster turnaround of the exploitation, the initial access, and then achieving their objectives.
Which leads quite well into another major point made in the report: the prevalence of living off the land
Mm.
techniques used within these attacks. Can you give me some examples that you've seen, that we've seen when we've responded, of living off the land attacks, and maybe what they are for the broader audience as well?
Yeah, so I think living off the land, like when you think of it traditionally, it's sort of using built-in tooling within Windows to achieve specific things. But what we sort of see, which I guess is kind of living off the land as well, is threat actors just utilizing tools that aren't malicious and they're already in the environment. So a great example of that is like Screen Connect. And we've actually had incidents where Screen Connect was within the environment. It was expected. It was used by the MSP to remotely manage systems, which is quite normal. It might not be Screen Connect. There's plenty of other tools out there that do it. But the threat actor installed their own Screen Connect as well. And if you're not looking for that, you're just seeing Screen Connectors running on a machine. You're like, that's fine. Like that's intended. That's normal behavior. But if you sort of dig a bit deeper and you start looking at the instance IDs, that's when you'll be like, okay, something's not quite right there. So we see a lot of that. And again, other tools that aren't malicious but are used legitimately within organizations like FileZilla. Again, we see that used all the time for data exfiltration, and it's kind of just blending in with normal execution of programs because it is used in the environment. It's expected.
Yeah, and this is where I think, from a defensive point of view, things like threat hunting really come into their own. It's a conversation I've had with a lot of our clients recently, where they ask, why do we need threat hunting when we've
Mm,
got all these fancy security tools that should detect the things that you're hunting for, right? And a lot of the time, the answer is those living off the land techniques, because the tools can't detect things that are seen as legitimate activity on the network. The SOC would be slammed with 1,000 alerts, right? Trying to go
mm.
through every single one of them. So using these threat hunts to really target those living off the land techniques and evidence of them, I think is a really useful way to go about it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think in the report as well, there was a lot of, well, there's a sort of a mention around OT and that being a bit of a focus. Is that sort of, do you think that tying that back to what you mentioned before about sort of grey zone activities, do you think that's sort of why there's a lot more focus on OT in this report?
100%. Yeah. I think, when we talk about the mass compromise of infrastructure in a country by a competing nation state, OT's got to be such a big part of it. Now, you can think of OT as the really fancy technology that controls physical systems. When people think of OT, a lot of the time their mind goes to the electricity grid or maybe our
Mm,
water systems. And these things do feature in the report prominently. But I think what's important to note is there's so much stuff outside that scope as well. So many things that could be internet connected, and perhaps they're not even of national significance or huge importance, but that doesn't matter to the nation state. They're just going to
mm,
compromise as many as possible so that if push does come to shove, right, they're able to affect as much IT infrastructure as they can.
yeah,
So, the widespread vulnerabilities in some of these things, many of them can't get updates or haven't been updated in many years, maybe end of life, but performing a critical function. It's quite a difficult problem. I think what goes hand in hand with that too is another mention this year of small business routing type equipment.
yeah,
Saw a few mentions in there where if you're a small business, just a mum and dad type shop with only a couple of employees, you're not going to get the fanciest modem or router off the shelf, right? You're
yeah,
going to get something cost effective. And then naturally that's going to go end of life eventually, but it's still providing you internet. So it just kind of sits there for several years. That's certainly a high value target for nation state
yeah.
threat actors.
And we've had incidents involving that as well. I think it was a Draytech router that was,
Yeah.
yeah, it was vulnerable and end of life and essentially initial access into the network. And that's just sort of one that's known about and very, very vulnerable. I'm sure there are plenty more, perhaps, of these sort of SMB targeted piece of networking equipment that have vulnerabilities that just maybe not necessarily known to the wider community, that are probably being utilized by groups like that.
Absolutely. And diving further into that too, when the report talks about these grey zone activities and the widespread compromise of this kind of infrastructure, I think one of the really relevant points is it talks about these activities occurring in the broader Indo-Pacific region as well. What
Mm,
really struck me big time this year, after kind of traveling into that region on two separate occasions, I went to Bali one time and then I went to New Caledonia later in the year, I couldn't help but think about if we're struggling with these issues in Australia and can't get on top of them in quite a progressive country that we're very fortunate in Australia to have a really good economy and to have the capabilities from a government point of view to address these things and try to attack them. How do these smaller Southeast Asian countries get on top of this? Right.
yeah,
I am convinced that all of their infrastructure must be compromised in one way or another. And that means when we travel to these places, it probably means our data's long gone. This
mm,
was exemplified earlier in the year when an article came out to say that the Bali passport system, the Indonesian passport system, had been compromised. And, I think it's an expectation that when we go to these places, you just have to accept that this is going to happen because
yeah.
it's so difficult for them to protect against it.
Yeah. I mean, it is difficult, and I don't know whether it's perhaps there's not enough like skill set. There's not enough like qualified people in those countries. I know the government are looking to assist where it's possible. I'm pretty sure, and I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure I read an article fairly recently where the Australian government sort of partnering with, I think it was the Philippines and it might have been another couple of countries to like actively share information about cybersecurity and help them sort of improve their security posture as well, which I think is probably a really good um, thing to do. Just, share the resourcing, share the knowledge.
Yeah, I have also seen several initiatives on that front too. And I mean, they're so positive, right? I'm quite involved with Crest, as you know. And I know a few people within Crest who have been traveling to that region several times this year to attend sit down roundtable type discussions for this exact problem, to try and form partnerships, to try and help them essentially raise their level of cyber maturity in general.
Yeah.
It's also such a hard task, isn't it? Such a big problem.
Yeah. Well, I think we could probably talk about the ACSC report all day. Is there anything else in particular you wanted to call out? Obviously, we recommend everyone go and have a read of it. There's a lot of very important information there. There's some case studies as well, showing how some of these incidents unfold. But is there anything else that you wanted to talk about particularly, Jack?
Look, a few quick notes that we'll gloss over in the interests of time. First one is that they noted that they notified 930 entities in the last year that they had potentially been compromised, which is, pretty similar to the stats last year. But what I thought was really interesting from our point of view, I think we noticed that it was happening a lot faster now. So in the past, where we might be brought into an incident response engagement and start taking the right steps to get this company back on track, we found that sometimes at that point down the track, when it had been a few weeks, we might get a notification from the ACSC, or the organization might, to say something malicious is going on. Whereas now we've had more and more responses that have been triggered by those ACSC notifications.
Yeah.
So it seems like they're getting more and more efficient there. I think that's a really important point. And perhaps the two other points that, it'd be remiss if we didn't mention them. AI, right?
Yeah, good old AI.
It has to be part of every conversation.
It does, yes.
I found it interesting that they actually referenced that really popular story that came out of Hong Kong with the executive that was scammed by the deep fake Teams meeting. It's interesting that they use that as kind of a reference and case study.
Yeah.
They noted that things like hallucination are a big risk. I mean, the typical things.
Yeah. I think AI, I definitely see and I get by that sort of LLMs and things like that and deep fakes. I think that it's only a matter of time before we do see it being a large part of attacks. We worked with one of the insurers that we work with. We went and did a presentation with them earlier this year where they said to us, all right, you've got permission to do a deep fake of one of the quite high up in the organization, and show us what can be done. And this particular individual had a very, very small footprint online. Like, I think there was a LinkedIn profile with one photo, and then the insurer also had like a news, it wasn't a news article, it was like a interview on a video as well, but there's background music playing. So you're just using those two things and not a lot of money on tooling. We're able to put together a decent deep fake of not only audio but also of like the face as well, and presented it to the insurer, and everyone's like, well, that's actually quite scary. You could, they could see how if you're in a Teams call, you could probably get away with it, and it's like realistic enough if you're not really, really looking at sort of the mouth movement and listening to the voice, that it's quite potentially going to be, actually them. So I do think that we will see an uptick in it. We from our own perspective haven't seen too much of it yet.
100% agree. 100% agree. And I think the two final points we should possibly touch on just quickly. Firstly, shout out to phishing resistant MFA.
Yeah,
that's a hugely important control that we found to be quite key over the last 12 months. So many MFA bypasses for traditional MFA methods coming along. So implementing phishing resistant MFA is really key, especially to prevent business email compromise attacks. And a final point that we have a good opportunity to shout out right now actually isn't from the ACSC report, but is certainly relevant.
Mm,
Only a few days ago, ASD announced that the limited use legislation has been passed in Australia. What this essentially means is now, when organisations pass the ACSC or the ASD information, legally, this cannot be used against you if you willingly disclose it in the interests of assisting the broader community. So it really encourages organizations to share that threat information, share that you've been compromised for the wider uplift of security
mm.
community. And I think that's great.
Yeah, I think that's a really good initiative because I know a lot of organizations might not be wanting to be forthcoming because, maybe let's just say that there was a misconfiguration that someone made that led to this ransomware, and that don't necessarily want to be like, yeah, we messed up, this is how we messed up, and share that information with the government. So I think this coming into place will hopefully put a lot of people's minds at ease around sharing that kind of information. And it is important, like that misconfiguration that was made by an organization, sharing that knowledge can then help inform others what went wrong and hopefully prevent them from suffering the same type of incident as well.
And then by receiving this information, the ASD can draw trends. They can look at where's the most important areas of focus. They can do things like release the ACSC annual report, right? It
Mm,
only increases the quality of that data and in general just helps everyone head in the right
yeah,
direction.
absolutely. Next one is the Texas teen arrested for scattered spider telecom hacks.
Bit of a tongue twister, isn't it?
It is. It is. There's a lot going on in that title.
It's heaps going on.
Yeah, I think.
So what's your understanding of this one? What's
Yeah.
happened?
So essentially, it's been in the news over the last few days where a 19-year-old from Texas was arrested from the FBI for alleged involvements in cyber attacks against like telecommunication companies and a bank as well. Sort of between the time period of October last year through to May of this year as well. And allegedly, this individual was executing phishing campaigns to get access to those organizations and then using that access to steal data like API keys and cryptocurrency. So I think what's particularly interesting in this case is the upon the arrest of this individual, they admitted to being part of the Scattered Spider cybercrime group, uh, um, which I think Scattered Spider, they're quite well known in the industry. Their name, when you hear that name, you're kind of thinking of the ransomware attacks against like Caesars Entertainment, MGM Resorts. But they're quite well known, aren't they, Jack, in the industry?
Absolutely. Do they have an affiliation with any particular country, Rich? Do you know? Or is it just kind of broad?
Uh, I believe there's been essentially the thought is that they are all sort of in Western speaking countries. I know there's been a number of individuals, I think it's five, that have been sort of arrested in the US, I believe it is. So there's definitely um, links to them being in the United States. And yeah, they're quite sort of known for their social engineering attacks as well.
Mm. And this article really focuses on that too. I think what I found quite surprising was I read this news story as it was breaking, and
Mm,
it was very much focused around one of the biggest attacks of all time against US telecom infrastructure. I was like, oh, well, just another one, right?
yeah.
Another one in the news. Not surprised. They're always being attacked. But then when it turned out that it was, a teenager from within the country who was acting against their country's own best interests, it really gets quite interesting, especially when that teenager is part of a broader threat actor group that is, I mean, for want of a better term, scattered across the
Mm.
world, across
Yep.
various countries. And it just goes to show that it's not always these two major nation state actors that we spoke about at the start of the podcast today. It can really be anyone at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I know Scattered Spider, they do sort of act as take part in ransomware as a service schemes as well. So they will work with ransomware groups utilizing their tools to commit these attacks. And I believe that there's sort of evidence to indicate that they have worked across multiple ransomware groups as well. So it's kind of like they're not particularly, I guess you could say, tied to a particular ransomware group as well. They sort of, will pick and choose who they work with as well, which I suppose when you have the level of success that they have had in at least the attacks that are known publicly, where an organization has, put out releases about it. So, Caesars and MGM obviously very public, but there'll also be no doubt attacks by Scattered Spider that aren't publicly known because the organization end up paying a ransom for, most of the time. If that's the case, that's going to be because they were in a position where they had to pay for a decryption tool.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, if that happens in Australia in the future, then legally it's probably disclosable. Seems like we're heading in that
Yes.
direction. That's
Yeah.
probably a different discussion.
Yes.
I think a few other things about this Scattered Spider attack as well, quite heavily focused on phishing. It's interesting that in Australia, the focus right now is very much on vulnerable, exposed devices and also on credentials that have already been compromised. So like password spraying attacks, brute forcing, and the reuse of compromised credentials in order to gain access to various systems. But it seems like Scattered Spider, or this individual at the very least, was almost like a super fisher, right?
Yep.
8.5 million phishing texts sent out to hijack telecom platforms. I mean, that is a huge scale for one person. A huge scale. But maybe he had access to infrastructure as a result of his affiliation with a group, right? And these groups typically do have massive, massive infrastructure across the world to support these attacks. It quite often goes unnoticed.
Yep.
Quite a relevant point and question I'd like to ask you, right? I mean, a 19-year-old, what do you think the factors are that lead someone like a 19-year-old to be involved with an international criminal organization, right? What do you think leads to someone being in that position? It's quite young.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose it's probably a lot of it would have to do with sort of growing up with technology and computers, and probably I would imagine that this individual's had an interest in it from a very young age, and obviously built up a good skill set with how computers work and how to take advantage of that as well. In when you're talking it from an offensive or a hacking point of view, I suppose. So I would imagine that would have a lot to do with growing up in the age of technology, being exposed to machines and computers at a young age, and then probably just the prevalence of information about how to do things like this as well. Like, we've obviously got all the hacking forums where tools are traded and bought and sold and things like that, which makes life a bit easier rather than sort of having to build something from scratch on your own.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, once you join these hacking forums, right? Perhaps at such a young age, an impressionable age, that become part of a group, and then you feel almost part of a community, even if that community is performing illegal activities, right?
Yeah.
One thing almost leads to another. There's so many hidden Discord chats and private dark web forums and signal chats, and it's all part of a group, and it's almost human nature to feel like, oh, I need to contribute. I'm part of this group now.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. I think a good preventative measure is perhaps redirecting those skills in the right direction when you can. right?
Yeah.
Because obviously, from a technology point of view, this individual seems quite talented, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Use plenty of applications to use those skills for good these
Yeah.
days.
We had an incident involving a school where a student is obviously very, very bright at IT, and they were maybe pushing the boundaries a little bit around what they should do in a school network. But at the end of the incident, it's kind of like maybe there might be an internship opportunity into the offensive team for this person, because they've obviously got a really good skill set. And it's just about pushing that into the right direction. Making a career out of it, rather a legal career out of it, rather than sort of going the other side, like this person here.
Indeed, indeed. And I think you'll find on the ethical hacking, offensive security side of things, there's not many people who haven't done one or two dodgy things on their school network growing up.
Yeah. Topic 3. So, yes, the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions, or the CDPP, secured 32 convictions for cyber offences in the last 6 years. What's happening with this one, Jack?
So it's a really interesting one. Um, it seems like there's been a bit of an inquiry into understanding how many prosecutions has actually been for illegal cybersecurity activities over the past 6 years. And that is interesting to understand. If I was someone who was legislating things in government, I'd probably want to know how effective the government is at being able to combat illegal cybersecurity activities in Australia,
Mm,
the capabilities that we have, and how successful the current set of controls that we have through legislation and whatnot have been as well. And I guess that's what they're looking at. So ultimately, 32 convictions, I think as well, 72 cases overall were referred by the looks of things for prosecution.
yeah.
Um, Unfortunately, probably my impression on this is that for 6 years in a country of many millions of people and lots of technology, those are some pretty low numbers. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I kind of expected it to be higher, to be honest. Like when they're sort of talking about the different kinds of offences that this can be, is like sort of dealing in financial information. There's child exploitation, cyber abuse, computer intrusions, unauthorized modification of data, destruction of data. So there's quite a lot that's sort of being brought into these stats. So that was kind of my takeaway as well. As I just honestly expected it to be a lot higher.
Yeah, and I think reading through some of these referred cases too, it seems like a lot of the time they come from government departments. There's a few
Mm,
that were listed here: Services Australia, Australian Commission for Law Enforcement Integrity, Australian Taxation Office, the Department of Defence. And when a government department is referring these cases, you can only imagine it must be pretty serious, whatever's happened here. And so to know that we're probably only looking at really almost absolute slam dunk referrals, right? Where
yeah,
there has to be probably quite an overwhelming amount of evidence to show that something's gone wrong, to show that someone has done something pretty bad. And yet, conviction rates of what, 32 out of 72. I think overall what it shows is just how difficult a problem this is, right? In the cyberspace. It shows how difficult it would be to convict people for doing these illegal things. It's probably analogous to our deeper investigations, right? Because
mm,
you're really limited to the evidence that you have available to you. I mean, I'm sure you
yeah,
can comment on how difficult it is to draw conclusions, particularly legal ones, when the evidence is limited.
yeah, and that's sort of when you're putting together a report, especially if it's going to court, is you're looking to get as much evidence as possible and be able to um, draw conclusions from that evidence. And you're right. Sometimes there just isn't evidence available to show this is definitively what happened, and that's kind of where you can make an educated assessment on something, but at the end of the day, you don't have the actual evidence to prove it, and perhaps that's why there would be so few that are going through this system, is because there's not enough evidence to definitively prove something, and maybe the CDPP is, they don't want to spend the time and resources and the money that's involved with going through a case where it's not, you can't prove something definitively. And unfortunately, that is something that we come across all the time. A lot of the cases that we deal with, obviously, the threat actors are overseas, so that they're very unlikely that they will be going through Australian court system. But we often encounter issues where the evidence is unavailable for various reasons. Either it's been encrypted, it's been wiped, the retention is poor. There's just a lot of different reasons behind it.
Yeah, and I mean, if we're struggling to analyze and gather enough evidence in the cases that we respond to, which sometimes is only days after the attack has occurred, then imagine with how slow the wheels of the legal machine turn,
The
how
wheels of
difficult it might
justice.
be. The wheels of justice. How difficult it might be for prosecutors to ensure they have the right evidence when it does take a while to get these
Yeah.
things through the processes that we have in place.
Yeah, it is a very slow process. Like, obviously, when I was working in law enforcement, I had a lot of cases involving electronic evidence, and some of those, the court systems, like, it would be years before I've had been asked to come and give evidence years after writing a report, just because it is a slow system.
Yes, the unfortunate realities of it. But it is a
Yeah.
good system. I mean, it's a system that keeps society moving, so we just have to keep improving it.
Yep.
So the final topic for today, Rich, the vulnerability of the fortnight. It looks like
Yes.
we have a critical security vulnerability affecting Mitel MiCollab. This one's pretty hot off the press, I think only a few days old. What's your understanding of this particular vulnerability?
Yeah, so I think we first sort of notified, I think it was actually through an ACSC notification regarding this, but essentially it's involving a multiple critical vulnerabilities in Mitel's MiCollab or MiCollab platform. And essentially what it can do, there's two vulnerabilities. We've got CVE 2024-35286 and CVE 2024-41713. And essentially what these would allow an attacker to do is execute arbitrary code. So we talk about remote code execution all the time and how that's not a great thing to have in systems, and allow access to sensitive information and potentially disrupt services as well. So yeah, not an ideal vulnerability to have exploited in your environment.
That's certainly the usual combination of impacts, the unauthorized remote code execution,
Yep.
and the usual things that lead to more widespread vulnerabilities. I mean, we've seen Mitel vulnerabilities in the past, haven't we, that have affected organizations that have led to wider compromise?
Yeah. We had a one in particular where it was sort of a Mitel voice or VoIP platform that a ransomware group had exploited, and then sort of a web shell lay dormant on the system, and they came back about 6 months afterwards to exploit it and sort of use that as initial foothold into the environment. A very sort of similar vulnerability with the remote code execution. So it can be quite impactful for an organization if it is exploited. I think that's probably why having segregation for systems like this, these sort of internet-facing systems, is really important, so that if you do have a 0 day or you can't patch something straight away for whatever reason, if it does get exploited, you're really limiting the exposure to your wider network to one system.
That's right. And it goes back to what we spoke about earlier with regards to threat actors exploiting these internet-facing devices and potentially just dropping a web shell and then leaving it there to come back later, right? That's what happened in the incident that we saw. So maybe you patch your system, within 2 or 3 days, which seems pretty good. But if a threat actor has already dropped the web shell in that time, it doesn't matter if you patch your system. The web shell's
Yep.
there. They can't exploit the vulnerability again, but they can certainly connect to their web shell and use that to pivot into the compromised network. And so identifying these web shells, performing threat hunts after the vulnerabilities come out to make sure there's none lying dormant on your systems, all important activities, but quite hard to do as part of a broader cyber strategy, that's for sure. Especially when these devices can't run security agents and sometimes people forget to ingest logs from them into a SIEM.
Yeah, it's definitely it can be a blind spot for organizations where you're right, you can't install your EDRs, you can't install the SIEM agents. So at best, you're probably relying on syslog coming through, which most people probably wouldn't set up, to be fair. So they are sort of a bit of a blind spot. In terms of the mitigations and strategies for this one, I believe that Mitel have released some patches as well, Jack, on how to remediate this one.
That's right. It does look like they have. So step number 1, patch the issue, right? That's pretty key.
Yep.
But step number 2, I would advise anyone to seriously consider if they actually need this exposed to the internet for operational purposes. Can you operate in a different way, a model under which you don't need to expose this to the internet? And you should make that consideration for every single thing that you have that is exposed to the internet. Typically, they should be part of an internal network. And if you need to connect to them, use a VPN with strong phishing resistant MFA, but also patch your VPN.
Yeah.
In addition, like you said, Rich, segregation, making sure you got those layers of security behind it so that if the worst does happen, it's not just game over. So that you can stop the threat actor 2 or 3 steps down the track rather than putting 100% of your reliance on the edge of the network.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Mitel have also they've got some support advisories as well. So if anyone is using Mitel MiCollab, however it's pronounced, definitely recommend checking out the security advisories on their website. They have got the updates versions that resolve this remediation. There's also some points as well you can use to threat hunt in various logs for any evidence of exploitation, which, as Jack mentioned before, it's worth doing if you've had this exposed to the internet with the vulnerability for even an hour. I'd highly recommend doing some threat hunting to make sure it hasn't been exploited. And like Jack mentioned before, you've got a web shell sitting dormant for someone to come and interact with.
That is right. Well, I guess that probably brings us to the end, Rich. So
Yes.
I hope we don't have too many of these Mitel-related style vulnerabilities over the Christmas break.
We'll find out.
Touch wood.
Yep. Excellent. Yeah. Well, yes, thanks very much for coming along today, Jack. So we'll be taking a little bit of a break over the Christmas period. So we should be back on the first week of January, I believe it is. We'll have a new episode out then. And yeah, just wishing everyone who listens a happy holiday period and hopefully no incidents for them.
Absolutely. Stay safe and I hope your sock stays quiet.
Excellent. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.